Paul, listen to me. I don't even like dogs!
The story is set just after World War II, when ships begin bringing soldiers back home. Sergeant Paul Sutton steps off a dock with one simple dream: to build a life with his wife Betty, whom he had married right before heading off to war. Paul's hopeful expression fades as he searches the crowd for her face, then searches again, more slowly this time, more carefully, as though he might have simply overlooked her among the flags and flowers. He hasn't missed her. The men around him are pulled into the arms of their loved ones, while Paul stands alone in the space their reunions leave behind. He makes his way to the apartment they had shared before his deployment, touches the small locket holding her photograph, and pushes the door open. Inside, Betty is dressed in pale green lingerie and appears caught off guard by his arrival. She quickly moves toward him and wraps him in a hug. Betty says she had no idea Paul would be walking through the door that day, which puzzles him since he had told her about his return in the letters he wrote to her almost every single day across 4 years of war. Betty admits with some embarrassment that she had stopped reading his letters because the vivid descriptions of battle had become too painful for her. She did keep them, though. This cuts Paul deeply, because writing to her had been the one thing that kept him going on the battlefield. Still, he pushes down the hurt and chooses to forgive her because love is the only thing he has come home wanting. Right away, Betty brings up the economic boom happening around them and tells him she has already convinced his old employer to take him back. But Paul no longer wants to sell chocolates. He had written in those unread letters about the future he had been dreaming of. A house full of children, quiet mornings, a simple and peaceful life. Betty, however, talks only about money and the better things it can bring, and insists he go back to selling chocolates, arguing that more income means a better life. Paul gives in and agrees, and they share a warm reunion. By the following morning, Paul is already dressed and heading out, leaving a gentle kiss on Betty's sleeping forehead before boarding a train to Sacramento to resume his job as a chocolate salesman. On the train, he notices a composed but clearly stressed young woman struggling to pull a suitcase down from the overhead rack. It topples, scattering its contents, including a framed photograph of her and her father. Paul jumps up to help, the train sways and he stumbles, landing awkwardly on top of her, and before either of them can recover, she turns pale and is sick all over his uniform. He holds no grudge, and quietly heads to the bathroom to clean up without a word of complaint. Back in his seat, Paul drifts off, only to be pulled back into nightmares from the war. He wakes with a start and feels relief that it was only a dream, but when he looks around, the young woman is gone. He disembarks in San Francisco to catch a bus to Sacramento, and by some stroke of luck, spots the same woman again. She is puzzled as to why Paul is taking a bus when his train also passes through Sacramento. As it turns out, their tickets had been mixed up during the chaos on the train. She feels terrible about all the trouble, but Paul waves it off completely. None of it was her fault. She introduces herself as Victoria Aragon, a graduate student on her way back to her family's vineyard in Napa Valley. Then 2 drunk men board and start bothering her. Paul's instincts from his time as a soldier kick in instantly, and he steps in without hesitation, confronting them and getting into a fight. The result is that all 3 men are put off the bus. Paul sets off down the road toward his destination, but stops when he finds Victoria sitting on the roadside with her luggage, clearly upset. He asks what is wrong, and she opens up. She is terrified to go home and face her father because she is pregnant by a professor who walked away and took no responsibility. She is convinced her father will turn her away if she arrives without a husband. Paul wants to help her and the child she is carrying. He offers a simple plan. He will pose as her husband for just one night, long enough for her to walk through the front door with her dignity intact. He is honest with her that he is a married man and makes clear the arrangement will end the very next day. Victoria, out of desperation and with some hesitation, accepts. As they approach the vineyard, the hills rise above drifting clouds soaked in afternoon light. Its beauty stops Paul in his tracks, and Victoria tells him her family calls the land Las Nubes, meaning the clouds. Before they go in, Paul pulls the foil wrapper from a piece of chocolate and shapes 2 makeshift rings, one for her finger and one for his, standing in for real wedding bands. Then the quiet is broken by gunshots. The 2 take cover, but the alarm fades when Victoria recognizes her father as the one holding the rifle. Alberto, Victoria's father, erupts with fury and disbelief when she introduces Paul as her husband. He turns on his heel and storms back to the house, calling for his wife. The commotion draws the rest of the household and the workers outside. Even so, everyone greets Victoria with warm embraces and genuine happiness at having her home. In the middle of Alberto's anger, she announces that she and Paul are married. The news shocks the entire family. Alberto's rage only grows when he discovers that Paul sells chocolate for a living. But the women of the household, Victoria's mother Marie and her grandmother Guadalupe, manage to soften the mood with kindness and hospitality, while Victoria's grandfather Don Pedro welcomes Paul without reservation and even praises the chocolates he sells. Paul is invited to join the family at dinner, where Alberto puts him through a sharp round of questioning about his background. When Alberto finds out Paul is an orphan, he sneers that a man with no roots and no history has no place marrying into a family with their respected Mexican heritage. Paul stays calm, absorbs every word without firing back, thanks them for the meal, and steps outside to get some air. Victoria follows him into the dark and apologizes, but Paul seems to understand, at least somewhat, where Alberto's anger is coming from. That night, their act earns them the use of Victoria's parents' master bedroom, though Paul quietly chooses to sleep on the floor rather than share the bed out of basic respect. In a smaller room, Marie nudges Alberto to go say goodnight to the supposed newlyweds. Unable to argue with his wife, Alberto marches into the master bedroom and delivers a stiff goodnight. Paul scrambles to get into the bed beside Victoria, but Alberto's sharp eyes have already caught the blanket lying folded on the floor. The man says nothing more and leaves. Deciding they need to be more convincing in case anyone else walks in, the two agree to simply sleep in the bed together. A moment of quiet tension passes between them, but Paul breaks eye contact and settles in for the night. Paul is pulled awake by another nightmare, calling out Victoria's name as he surfaces. When she reaches out to calm him, the sound of bells suddenly erupts outside. A frost has crept over the vineyard in the night, spreading across the vines like a slow disaster. The entire household and all the workers rush out and light heat pipes to push warmth through the rows. Paul asks what he can do, and Alberto tells him sharply to stay out of the way. But Victoria shows him how to use wide pieces of cloth, moving them like wings, to sweep the warm air toward the grapes. By the time the sun burns through the cold morning air, the vines have been saved. Now Paul prepares to head on to Sacramento. But Don Pedro has other ideas. He takes Paul on a walk through the vineyard's long history, leading him up to a fenced hilltop where the family's founding ancestor had planted the very first vine in the 16th century. He tells Paul that an orphan is simply someone still waiting to find where he belongs, and that, if Paul ever wants it, he already has a place among the Aragons. The warmth of those words moves Paul, and he accepts them, but he still says he cannot stay past the following day. Don Pedro does not push, but he does let Paul know that Alberto has already predicted he will leave, and that when he does, it is Victoria who will suffer for it. Not wanting to cause her more pain, Paul decides to stay just one more day. Harvest Day at Las Nubes arrives like a festival. Victoria's younger brother Pedro comes home from Stanford and greets Paul without suspicion or hostility, just open arms. The family and workers flood into the vineyard together, picking grapes and filling the rows with laughter and song. Paul studies Alberto's movements, mirrors them, and falls into a friendly, unspoken competition that ends with both men setting down their heavy crates of grapes at almost the exact same moment. The energy lifts into celebration, the musicians start up, and the women climb into the large wooden vat to crush grapes underfoot. Victoria is allowed to join as well, since as far as everyone around her knows, she is a married woman. The women pull Paul into the vat too, urging the couple to dance together in the crush of fruit. They move closer together in a way that has nothing to do with the lie they are living. Later, still damp with juice and caught up in the music, they finally kiss when no one else is watching, with an intensity that surprises them both. But Paul pulls away as though he has touched something hot. He tells her plainly that he has fallen in love with her far more than he ever anticipated. But he is still a married man, and he will not betray either Victoria or his wife. Shocked and heartbroken, Victoria turns away and cries long into the night. while Paul lies alone on the sofa, troubled and unable to sleep, knowing that doing the right thing does not always feel like a relief. He is brought back to the present by the sound of Pedro and Alberto arguing in the living room. Pedro wants the winery to modernize, and Paul suggests that bank loans could act as a safety cushion in difficult years. Alberto snaps at him to stay out of it. In the heat of the argument, Alberto points out that Paul and Victoria do not behave like a real married couple, especially now that Paul has been sleeping on the sofa. Paul responds that Victoria's well-being is very much his concern because he cares about her. As Paul gets ready to leave, he notices Victoria doubled over with stomach pain. He goes to her and offers to stay one more night to help her get through the stress caused by her father's temper, but she tells him to go. She says it was never his problem to begin with. She walks away, and he follows, but instead finds Alberto in the barrel room. Alberto makes it plain again that Paul will never have a claim to the winery regardless of the marriage, to which Paul responds by asking Alberto whether he actually loves his daughter. Alberto insists that everything he does comes from love for his children, and Paul tells him it is time to start showing it. Victoria has been within earshot and steps in. She does not understand why her father controls her so tightly, or why he has taken such a dislike to Paul. Alberto holds his position, but his daughter is exhausted by his temper. She asks whether she should simply leave, and Alberto says he only wants the truth. Once again, Paul is on the verge of leaving, but Don Pedro draws him into sharing a glass of homemade brandy, and before long, they are both a little drunk and singing a romantic Latin song together. Don Pedro teaches Paul the words so he can sing it beneath Victoria's window, backed by a mariachi band. Paul delivers the song with rough, genuine feeling that pulls people out of their sleep to listen. Even Alberto finds himself wondering whether he has been too hard on Paul, whether the man truly loves his daughter after all. Don Pedro tells Paul that if Victoria's lamp comes on in her bedroom window, it means she has accepted him. When the last note fades, the window stays dark. Paul starts to walk away in defeat. But then the light appears, a little late, a little hesitant. Paul, who has always trusted duty more than hope, decides to leave anyway. He ends up at the Harvest Festival the following day, since the bus departs from nearby. Victoria and her family arrive for the blessing of the wine. She spots Paul and comes over with 2 glasses of wine to share a toast. Alberto joins them and introduces Paul to the priest as his son-in-law, then announces there will be a wedding that very evening. Taken aback, Paul quietly tells Victoria that they cannot keep building on a lie, and she agrees that she will tell her family the truth herself. Before she goes back to them, Paul presses his bronze star, a military decoration he earned in the war, into her hands as a gift for the child she is carrying. She then walks to Alberto and tells him everything, the pregnancy and the fact that there is no husband. While her family takes in the news, Paul quietly slips away from the celebration. He catches a ride toward Florida. On the way, he falls asleep again, and the nightmare comes back. This time, he and Victoria are walking hand in hand, with a child between them, when a sudden explosion tears everything apart. He jolts awake, still in the car. He reaches Betty's apartment, only to find her in bed with another man. Betty tells him, not with cruelty, but with a cold finality, that the life he has always wanted is not one she will ever want. She has already filed annulment papers, and all she needs is his signature. Paul walks out with the papers in hand. He feels unsteady at first, but then something shifts. Because if he is no longer tied to Betty, he can go back to Victoria. He heads straight back toward Napa, hitchhiking the entire way, and by the time he reaches Las Nubes, the sky is already dark. He finds Alberto drinking heavily with some of his men, raw with wounded pride. Paul wakes him and stands his ground openly, asking for permission to marry Victoria and promising to be a father to the child she carries. Alberto fires back that Paul is a married man. Even after Paul shows him the annulment papers, Alberto reaches for his gun. Empty-handed, he launches himself at Paul instead, who sidesteps every swing. In the chaos, Alberto hurls an oil lamp at Paul. It misses and strikes the edge of the vineyard, and the vines catch fire. The blaze travels fast, jumping from one plant to the next until the whole field is burning. Paul moves without hesitating, soaking his jacket in water and throwing himself at the flames. The rest of the family and workers come running, Victoria among them. She sets aside the shock of seeing him and immediately works alongside him to fight the fire. Everyone scrambles to save what they can. Pedro joins the effort, but his clothes catch fire and he panics. Through the screaming chaos, Paul plunges his clothes into a barrel of water, races into the flames toward Pedro, and wraps him in wet cloth to smother the fire at his legs. Alberto, frozen at first by shock and the weight of what his temper has caused, finally charges toward the rose himself, but Don Pedro pulls him back. In the end, the fire is too far gone. Las Nubes burns entirely. When the night finally exhausts itself, dawn arrives and shows the full damage with brutal honesty: blackened stubs where green rose once stretched, smoke still curling above the chapel on the hill. The Aragon family and their workers weep together, watching everything they had built and depended on disappear in a single night. Don Pedro mourns what he believes is lost, not just the harvest or the year's income, but the very soul of the family's legacy. Everyone assumes the ancient vine on the hilltop, the one their ancestor planted centuries ago, has burned along with everything else. Watching the family's grief, Paul decides to do what feels too hard for any of them right now. He takes a shovel and climbs to the hilltop with stubborn, quiet determination. He kneels in the ash and digs carefully with his hands until he lifts the ancient vine's blackened root from the ground. It looks destroyed, its surface charred and flaking, but he carries it down to Alberto regardless. He asks Alberto to cut into it, to check whether the fire has burned all the way through. Alberto stares at him for a moment, then pulls out his knife with urgency. He peels away a strip of burnt bark and catches his breath at what he finds beneath. The core is still alive. That single small piece of surviving life is enough to return courage to everyone gathered around. Don Pedro cries out that Las Nubes is not finished. With laughter still wet with tears, Alberto turns and thanks Paul, and means it. Despite everything that had passed between them, he finally sees clearly that Paul is a good man with a courageous heart. As a gesture of that trust, he cuts a living piece from the root and hands it to Paul to replant, not as an outsider, not as hired help, but as family. In the quiet that follows, Paul takes Victoria's hand and slides a real ring onto her finger. The entire family erupts in celebration as the couple seal their commitment with a kiss. The fields stand empty and scorched, and yet something in the moment feels less like a feeling and more like a choice. The deliberate, patient act of planting what is still alive and tending it until it grows again. The film closes on Paul, the orphan who came home from war with nothing but a promise he could not keep, now living the very future he once wrote about in letters that were never opened, surrounded by a new family rooted at last in Las Nubes.